Hello, I'm John Grossman, a volunteer with the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and I'm happy to welcome you to the third and last session of our September webinar series. This session titled The Peshtigo Paradigm. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Steve Pyne. He's an emeritus professor in the Human Dimensions Faculty, School of Life Sciences, Arizona State University, a past president of the American Society for Environmental History, and the recipient of numerous fellowships and honors. He's written a score of books, of which a dozen deal with fire on Earth. Among them are fire histories of the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, including Russia, and one on Earth overall, titled World Fire, A Brief History, one of a couple of his that I've read. His interest in fire grew out of 18 seasons with the National Park Service, of which 15 were spent with the North Rim long shots, the subject of his book, Fire on the Rim. He's presently contributing his part to the exurban fire problem with a cabin bordering the Apache National Forest, from which location he joins us online tonight. As I now hand off to our presenter, be aware of two issues for successful participation. First, note questions you may have for the presenter and take time to pose them via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, not the Q&A. He will respond to them at the end of the session. Second, if you're new to Zoom, and you have challenges navigating the system, pose those questions in the same screen, and the facilitator will reach out to you personally during the session. Now, along with you, I look forward to this evening's presentation.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks to the association for the chance to speak on the 150th anniversary of the Peshtigo fire. In some ways, part of the story is what we might call the Peshtigo paradox, that an event that has celebrated itself as a forgotten fire is in many ways one of the best known and most documented. Well, what is it? But how can we understand it? And why do I think of it as a paradigm? What are the lessons and legacies we might derive from it? Well, I'll try tonight to give you some of the basics, but then try to widen the aperture and look at the larger context, both in the United States and perhaps beyond. Let's sped the days, fearful days, but they brought no relief. The sky was brass, the earth was ashes. Frank Tilton's sketch of the Great Fires, this was written in 1871, shortly after the fires had made their way through the North Woods. The context was one of rapid settlement, land clearing, and logging. Incredibly, we actually have a map of forest fires for the 1880 census. And this is what it looked like. Now, it doesn't include grasslands, deserts, sage steppes, and so forth. So some areas are not well represented because they weren't considered part, and some weren't because there weren't good correspondence to record it. But we can see the events of 1871, 9 years before, are situated within an area of pretty heavy burning. And it's a mixture of burning. Mostly it's tied with logging and land clearing and the larger process of settlement. Now, Peshtigo was essentially a community founded for this, along the edge of a river, entering into the Great Lakes. And that was its major reason to exist. Much of the rest of the region not all had access to a river, and railroads were the primary vehicle for it. This was, in a sense, the map in the background I showed you was sort of, America was sort of the Brazil of its day. And if you think of the things that have characterized the fire scene in Brazil in recent decades, they mapped pretty easily onto the American scene. And this was, in a sense, our Trans-Amazon Highway. This is actually in Michigan shortly afterwards. And you can see opening up the woods in a dramatic way, and then casting sparks to all sides, leading to burned out countryside. And this would be typical of what was left in the wake of the axe. And you can see why, under the right conditions, it could essentially explode. And this is what happened at Peshtigo, which had a large mill, and the countryside was well disturbed. The town itself was largely made out of products of that countryside. So here we are, October 8th, the passage of, this is a reconstruction of what the weather was like at that time. Passage of the front, typical of that time of year. After green up, after curing has begun, a dry period, and then a fast-moving cold front passing through, and that would engulf the entire region. So what we remember is the Peshtigo fire was actually part of a much larger complex, not all of which was recorded, but interestingly enough, also extended to Chicago. So the fire itself was recorded in woodcuts and words, and then shortly after the destruction in photographs. It's actually quite an astonishing record for 1871, all in all. The scenes, we have an eyewitness account from a French missionary priest who resided at the area, Peter Pyne, and one of the most horrific events he describes as happening at the bridge that spans the Peshtigo River. So there was a frightful pell-mell, impossible to describe. Everyone thought that there was safety on the opposite side of the river. Those who lived on the east side drove themselves to the west side, and those who lived on the west side drove themselves to the east side. This ensured that the bridge was blocked by crowds of cattle, vehicles, women, children, and men who were pushing each other out of the way to find an escape. And shortly after everyone had crowded on the bridge itself caught fire. We don't know how many people died as a result of this complex. The estimates vary between 400 and 1,400. There is no accurate account. It was certainly, almost certainly the most devastating forest fire of this kind of which we have record. But one of the interesting aspects of the Peshtigo fire was that it occurred the same day as the Great Chicago Fire. Actually, Chicago had had several great fires, but this was the Great Fire of 1871. And in many ways, the forest, the city was essentially a reconstituted forest, and it burned the same way. And if you look at the movement of the fire through the town, you can see the passage of the cold front. So it behaved exactly as the fires around Peshtigo itself did. And this in many ways accounts for the Peshtigo paradox, because the two fire events were linked. They were linked in Tilton's report. They were linked by Harper's Weekly and other journalists of the day reporting on it. And Chicago fire was a real shock. It caused a panic in the stock market. It also led in the Reconstruction to what is generally recognized as the birth of modern architecture in the United States, and the rebuilding, at least in part, with iron and glass rather than rebuilding it in wood. And this fact, the fact that the two were linked, meant that the Peshtigo fire was not forgotten, as so many others of the era were. So it was recorded, the city and the countryside, in national news reports, and then later in subsequent books, and especially in Peter Pyne's account, which he wrote shortly afterwards to help pay for rebuilding the church that was lost. His edition was written originally in French, translated immediately into English, then reprinted by the Wisconsin Historical Society, and now has been retranslated with a very thorough biography of Pyne himself, how he came to be there and what he thought of it, in a very recent translation by Charles Mercier. But this was only one of many in post-Civil War America, particularly in the Northern Tier. 1881, Great Fire in Michigan. Also commemorated in many ways, repeating the cycle of events that had occurred at Peshtigo, with one addition. This was the first time the Red Cross intervened in a civilian disaster. So the fires contributed that. Here's a relief train organized partly by the Red Cross, but otherwise, as elsewhere, by conscriptions and personal appeals. There was no organized governmental mechanism by which to provide relief. 1894, the Phillips Fire, Wisconsin, the Hinckley Fire in Minnesota, perhaps 420 or so died in the Hinckley Fire. You can see the cutover region now burned. They're actually bringing out some of the dead. The trains were intimately involved with all these, both as causing the initial disturbance, then distributing sparks, setting most of the fires, and then dramatic rescue operations, some of which succeeded and some of which failed. 1908, the fires ripped across the entire northern border from British Columbia to Maine, all recorded major fires. Metz, Michigan, interesting photo. You can see that the escape by train had to be early enough because the tracks themselves could warp and derail the train if it came too late, on into the Adirondacks and then on into the White Mountains of New England and Maine. It was the last large major fire for both the Adirondacks and Maine. The Adirondack story is also interesting because we don't think of this as a fire-prone landscape. 1903, 600,000 acres burned. 1908, roughly 400,000 acres burned, one in the fall, one in the spring, the two periods of dryness where this was possible. And the trains are an interesting portion of it. In this case, the trains were used to bring in firefighters from other communities, even from New York City. But the train going to one, Long Lake West in the Adirondacks, was actually recorded as having set 8 fires while it was on its way to bring relief to the one that was the original provocation. In 1910, famous for the great fires in the Northern Rockies, but that's really stands outside the Peshtigo paradigm because this was on federal land. This was on national forest, newly constituted 5 years before. The U.S. Forest Service had been organized to oversee these forests, and it was a challenge to them. So in many ways, it was a true wildland fire, perhaps our first. The Bodette fire was very much in the Peshtigo tradition. And I want to spend a little time with it because we have a relatively complete series of photographs as well as written accounts. So there's actually a picture of the fire, October 7th, one day by calendar ahead of the Peshtigo burn. So this is obviously a regional complex. This would be a sample of the settlement patterns. This time, everything made out of wood, everything available to burn. There had been a pronounced dry spell, and many of the wetlands and muskegs had been dry enough that they could preserve fire, would smolder there, and then when conditions turned better for burning, the fires leaped out of these as well as the usual array from settler burning and trains and so forth. This is what Bodette looked like before the fire, and this is what it looked like afterwards. 2 weeks after the burn, remember we're in October, so winter is coming, and if people are going to stay, they have to rebuild the community pretty quickly. There is a massive relief effort, and part of that is to bring in construction materials so people can build shelters. 3 weeks after the burn, here we are, and so it goes. A lot of this was driven, of course, by humanitarian instincts, but also alarm that if the word got out that this was a dangerous place, then people might cease to come and the real estate market would crash. So what we've seen recently in places like California, were all had their rehearsal earlier. Relief trains were a common feature. Again, the Red Cross would be mobilized and set up tents to provide aid. Most of the aid was simply by conscription. Usually the wife of the governor or some other figure would organize this, and people would contribute funds and so forth. And the militia was called out to maintain order. There's a recurring obsession in all of this with the prospects of looting It's hard to see what you could loot out of the ash, but nonetheless, the fear of major disturbance that would give rise to large-scale looting was a rationale for calling out the troops, and the militia was always there. They did less to reconstruct, more as a presence of authority. And the dead, 27 died in these fires. Again, not all, excuse me, the people could be identified. They would be found wherever they were. There was no organized firefighting effort, so you don't have organized crews that might be overrun. You have lots and lots of people out in the countryside, in many cases setting backfires to protect their particular farm or property. And this is one way, an additional way the fires tend to become very large. People see smoke, they know it's the time of the year that's very vulnerable to fire. So they will take preemptive action, try to protect their farm and fields by burning. So in a sense, it's kind of spot fire ignition by people. And in this case, many of them needed to be buried hastily and were simply buried in a common grave. Then afterwards, there would be some sort of memorial event. This is a year later. There would be a ceremony. There would be a plaque. Accounts would be collected or written. Often a school teacher or the wife of a minister or some other member of the literate class would collect these objects, would collect the stories, and then publish it. And in this way, try to remember the account. So this is a fairly predictable formula, and in many ways is still with us. But the first real rehearsal for it, I think, was in Peshtigo, and all of the other surrounding areas copied it. If we want to be a little more historically technical, or if not arcane, the first of the great fires is surely the 1825 fire that burned into New Brunswick and Maine, probably 4 million acres in all. But that was in a different country. The mechanisms for dealing with it were not very well defined. And the real cycle starts after the Civil War. We have some early fires, 1867, 1869, but 1871 really starts it. And then it continues for the next 50 years. It continues in Cloquet, Moose Lake, Minnesota in 1918. Here, I think 418 people, 425, I'm sorry, are known to have died. Towns were wiped out. And a novelty here that instead of trains evacuating people tried to flee in their cars, which has a very macabre, if modern, ring to it, and were overtaken by the flames. The railroads were implicated here in starting the fires, but the new wrinkle was that the United States was still at war. And the railroads had been nationalized as part of the war effort. So the federal government now found itself vulnerable to lawsuits for having started this fire. And it simply refused to deal with it and found ways to delay it, et cetera, all the way through the 1920s, and was not finally resolved until Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal arrived. So it was a very arduous process of trying to recover some kind of compensation. And it isn't just the United States. We see this all over. You can find comparable fires, if you wish, in Russia, Australia, Sweden. I had the chance to spend Fulbright in northern Sweden at Umeå, and that town, very similar sort of process of logging. Many of the techniques were transferred over across the Atlantic. Umeå was burned in 1868, 1878, and 1888. Before there was nothing left to burn but birch. It became known as the city of birch. But this is very typical of this process. And here we are on the other side of the Great Lakes, Canada. systematically trying to patrol in the wake of the railroads. And this would be the sort of countryside that would result. And you were on the Canadian Shield. The wetlands could be dried out and burned. There would be nothing left but sand and rock. And a famous image, the 1911 Porcupine Fire in Ontario. Some of you may have seen this. It's often reproduced, and I'm sorry, it's a great photo. And the image of the town shows you why it is so vulnerable. Even the sidewalks are made of wood. Sawdust is everywhere. There's combustibles all over the place. Unfortunately, this is a bogus photograph. The photograph of the town is real. I've always wondered why these people were so nonplussed with this firestorm bearing down on them. The issue is that was added. And these were all photographed on glass plates. So you could paint on the glass plates and that would be reproduced. So this is the enhanced, this is the Photoshop version of its day of the Porcupine Fire. That is an actual photograph taken. The fires burned in Cochrane as well as Porcupine. 1916, they burned again in Cochrane, and this time in Matheson. 1918, they destroyed the town of Haileybury. So the United States is not unique on this. The similar kinds of environment, similar kinds of economic use, excuse me, similar kinds of weather, and you got these large fires. Now back to the US, the wildlands and the cities, keeping our Peshtigo and Chicago link. Many of these landscapes, particularly where they were filled with organic soil, repeatedly burned and eventually burned hot, simply burned down through the roots into sand, of which Sand County, I think, of Aldo Leopold fame is partly a monument. And the cities, the last of the great urban fires we had was in 1906, following the earthquake in San Francisco. And that's what San Francisco looked like, except for some of the most built up areas, which were stone and brick. Everything was burned. And even those stone structures were filled with combustibles inside, so they burned. So what was the country doing while all this is going on? Well, began to take notice, particularly, most of the federal government's relationship to the public domain was committed to privatizing it as fast as possible. But some areas we began to set aside for parks and after 1891, forest reserves. So the first federal firefighting force appears in Yellowstone in 1886 when the US Cavalry took over administration of the park, and that was later extended to Sequoia and Yosemite in California in 1890. So that provided one model. The General Land Office was responsible for these forest reserves and was not really equipped to do very much with them. Their whole organization had been set up to dispense with land, not to manage it. Under threat of state action, a number of logging companies organized into timber protective associations to provide their own fire protection services. This became known as the Idaho idea. It was particularly prominent in the Northwest and later of cooperative forestry that became very prominent in the Northwest in the 1920s and 30s. The Adirondacks, had a lot of fire. They had special fire trains and special engines for pumping water and carrying stuff around. And it was not trivial. The management of those parks, particularly with regard to fire, became the model for managing the national forests. After the National Academy of Sciences arranged for a committee to make recommendations on what to do with the national forest. So 10 years after the Adirondacks Park came up with a program headed by a man named Sargent. Sargent found himself in charge of the national effort. And so that experience went west. And there was lots and lots of unpatented land that is still private land in places like Arkansas and the interior of Florida, which are very prone to burn. And early efforts by the Forest Service and others came to bear. This is a crew in Arkansas. They had special shields and wands to dispense water off of sort of extinguishers mounted on mules. U.S. Geological Survey was called on to make maps of the country. So we have a whole suite of maps from the Western U.S. Following that, and as I said, the National Academy made recommendations. And those recommendations begin with the question of whether fire control is possible. 1897, following the recommendations of the Academy, the National Forests receive an Organic Act. They won't become the responsibility of the U.S. Forest Service until 1905, but at least they have a charter. Here's Gifford Pinchot, who was a member of the Academy committee, was invited to join, along with John Muir, by the way. Here he is in 1898, a year later, arguing that, like the question of slavery, the question of forest fires may be shelved for some time at enormous cost in the end, but sooner or later it must be met. Actually, when he wrote that, he was writing about the fire scene in southern New Jersey. So it is not just the West, or not just particular places we now identify with large fires. Fire was extraordinarily prominent throughout the country. And again, to keep our symmetry with cities, you might recall that the National Fire Protection Association was organized in 1896. So there's a kind of parallel movement going on here in a weird kind of way. They are both going to be part of the reformist movements of the progressive era. Well, on wildlands, whoops, see, I got ahead of myself. Eventually, after we've established better control over it and declared that fire was going to be extinguished, we now have very active means for controlling fire in the West. And we've been watching for probably the last decade now in California and Oregon in particular, a wave of serial conflagrations that is not in some ways unlike what happened in the 19th and early 20th century. They have some different causes, but unlike then, we have all kinds of institutions, agencies, and machines to fight the fires. Imagine that I will point out very quickly here that all of these firefighting devices are dependent on fossil fuels. If we took away our airplanes and helicopters, our engines and bulldozers, chainsaws and power pumps, we would not be very effective at fighting these fires. We would have to manage them in the way people historically had. And now we're coming to grips with what the consequences of remove fire. Behind those fires were episodes like Peshtigo, that whole 50-year cycle around, particularly around the Great Lakes, but it got extended everywhere. And for cities, urban fires essentially disappeared. Why? Well, political responses that mandated codes, zoning, that put in a dense infrastructure that required fire insurance, mobilizing insurance companies. A whole raft of things were brought to bear, essentially under the agenda that we're not going to allow these cities to burn like that anymore. And that holds until 1991, when across the bay from San Francisco, Oakland burns big time. Over 3,000 structures burn. Fires coming in essentially off the open landscape, maintained open landscape for nature and recreation and so forth, coming into a community that thought large fires were a thing of the past. And in some ways, it's like watching polio come back. We'd fix this problem. Why are we having this? Why are all these modern cities burning? And it might be worth pondering that the megafire phenomenon is pretty much a pathology of the developed world. These are places that have converted to a fossil fuel society, or are trying very rapidly to. So places like Portugal and Greece, for example. In this case, the landscape is unhinged there, not because people are sending axes and chainsaws through it, but because they've abandoned the land and it has grown up essentially a feral state, and so they are having feral fires. So this is another topic that takes us a little bit away, but I want to come back to it eventually. So here, let's go back to 1910. The big blow up is in many ways the founding story for the Forest Service and for the American style of wildland firefighting. 3.25 million acres or so burned in a complex. This was a classic megafire, although not in a rural setting so much as in a mixed setting of which a lot of this is retained as public wildlands, and then Baudette, but giving us the other side of that in October. Well, 80 years later, here's what we say. Yellowstone, perhaps 40% or more of Yellowstone burned under high intensity and in some cases high severity fires, completely uncontrollable by all of the mechanisms at hand. At the same time, as I mentioned, Oakland informing us that we are entering an era of a kind of Pyrrhic pandemic, if you will, or a wave of contagions of combustion that will ramble through our towns. This is a pretty stunning aerial photo of the damage. 795 structures were burned in the first hour. But note that the trees threw fine and the open space stayed green. These are urban fires. Once they get started, they burn house to house, and the trees are not carrying the fires. The trees are being burned by the house fires. So this is where we are now, the two extremes: fire on the fringe, burning into towns, and fire in wildlands, in many cases, national parks or legal wilderness areas. Well, then we had lots of disturbed land, much ill-advised settlement. This was being cleared and then farmed. It was areas that would never support good farming, and for the most part would have to be abandoned eventually. Nonetheless, it was profoundly uprooted and burned. And the major motive force for it was the railroads, symbolizing our an industrial society and the shift to a kind of industrial combustion. Megafires resulted from massive amounts of fuel. All you needed were short spells of drought, mostly in the spring and fall. You didn't need 4 years of drought like California. 4 months were plenty, maybe 4 weeks, because it's the light stuff that was burning, and the light stuff doesn't need huge amounts of time. Well, today, here's a view of Paradise, California. We have a new set of disturbed lands, a different set of reasons. Some of it associated with logging and replanting. So a lot of the burned area in the countryside were plantations that burned very quickly. A lot of ill-advised settlement. Why are people living in such a risky, fire-prone landscapes? And instead of railroads, most of these fires are being set by power lines, which is an interesting example of two realms of combustion: industrial combustion, providing electricity, interacting with the world of living landscapes, the kind of fires they know. And this collision, the spark between the two, has proved very, very disastrous. So megafire, we have an excess of natural fuels. Many of these landscapes are not being treated. They don't need to be clear cut. Actually, massive cutting and slash piles are a major source of problem and fuel, but they're also being exacerbated by climate change, which is acting as a performance enhancer. In fact, I think if you add up all of the ways in which we're using combustion, both in living landscapes and what I think of as lithic landscapes, that is landscapes that were once living and are now fossilized and being exhumed out of the geologic past in the form of coal and natural gas and petroleum and so forth. Add up all of that, we're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. But that's a subject perhaps for another time. Back to our Peshtigo paradigm. Instead of being forgotten, it's been remembered and recalled. Peter Pernan's account has been reissued by the Wisconsin Historical Association, and a new edition has just come out this year. It's been the subject of histories and sort of fictionalized historical fiction accounts. It's been memorialized with markers. It has a museum. Of all of the fires of that era, it is probably better known than any of the rest. And one could also make an argument that with the exception of the 1910 big blow-up, because of its impact on the Forest Service, it may be one of the best recorded fires that we have. And we shouldn't forget that the combination, the 1-2 punch of Peshtigo and Chicago, is the reason why we have National Fire Prevention Day and National Fire Prevention Week. It tells us how you can burn 1 million acres. You can burn towns and a city, what it takes to do that. But one of the quirks of the Peshtigo fire scene, of course, it burned as fires and complexes do. It spared a convent nearby that had been established by a Belgian immigrant farm girl who had had a vision of the Virgin Mary, and then it established the convent. And for a number of years thereafter, for quite a while, there would be annual pilgrimages. But we don't need a religious explanation for it. Even Father Peter Pernin, in mulling over how to understand what happened, put it this way: who can fathom the designs of God? When these rights due him are ignored and trampled underfoot, our weak reason itself tells us that he must from time to time remind us of them and proclaim them by great cataclysms. Peshtigo, perhaps no more offending than other towns that were nevertheless spared, is the modern Sodom, meant to serve as an example to all. Well, today we're liable to journey to megafires and do it equipped with scientific instruments, but the same question in many ways may persist. And we might look for a more secular explanation that perhaps an omnipotent nature aroused to fury by humanity's misdeeds, obligated from time to time to unleash its terrible wrath as a reminder. The Anthropocene also has its Sodoms. We return to Frank Tilton's words. We might repeat them today for places like California, Oregon, British Columbia, or even Turkey and elsewhere in the world. With that thought, I'll leave you and we can open up for questions.
My name is Tom Giroux. I'll be facilitating the Q&A here. And really good presentation. We've got some nice questions loaded. Some of it you sort of answered in some of the presentation. And so you might just take an opportunity to recap what you talked about when I asked the questions. So, the first one isn't one of that type. It's what kind of trees were mainly involved in the forest at the time of the Peshtigo fire? So what was that like?
Yeah, they were mostly conifers, and that's a good question. I should have a better answer for it. They were particularly interested in white pine, was the premier tree, but they were also willing to take red pine And then later on, as the forestry grew to other species, the industry changed to accommodate whatever was there, ultimately ending up with aspen and some birch, I believe.
Yeah. So you kind of talked about this next question a little bit in your presentation, but when did these forest fires begin to prompt the establishment of state and federal development of wildfire response programs and organizations?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's a long feed-in for it, but the 1910 fires that burned in the Northern Rockies were the immediate source. The Forest Service lost 78 firefighters in 6 different incidents, all at the same time. 3 million acres went into debt, over $1 million, which was real money at that time. Traumatized, the next 3 chiefs of the Forest Service all the way through 1939 were all personally on the fire line. So the Forest Service became deeply invested in fire protection and determined it would never happen again on their watch. So it began to build up. It became the source of inspiration and funding and research for the other federal agencies. And part of the aftermath of the 1910 fires, Congress passed the Weeks Act, which did several things, one of which was to allow the Forest Service to expand by purchase into the eastern US. It was particularly a concern in the Appalachians. But the other thing was to set up cooperative programs with the states. And the basis of those programs would be fire control. So this was expanded in 1924 with the Clark-McNary Act. Eventually all the states would become involved. And this set up a matrix for federal state cooperation in fire control. And that remains the basis today.
So the next question has to do with the question about Wisconsin Emergency Management cites the Peshtigo fire as an event that drove wide development of municipal water systems. True in other areas and locales?
I don't know. What became important? Water was important, partly because if the watersheds contributed to navigable rivers, that allowed the federal government under the Interstate Commerce Clause to engage with the states for the protection of watersheds. But I don't know about municipal water systems. Sorry, I don't.
Yeah.
So it's still a major, watersheds are still a major concern now for cities.
So I'm going to ask a question of my own here, and I got to clarify another question with another member. But so you talked a bit about the California situation in western states and some of the configurations we've had out there. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation about what role climate change plays in that. And I think your slide talking about the kind of the way it's coming together and what's happening right now. Any commentary about climate change role in the Western fires that's happening right now?
Well, it's certainly contributing. As I say, it's acting, I would characterize it as a performance enhancer. These are all places that are fire prone. California is built to burn. It's built to burn explosively, but we're seeing stuff that is really off the scale. And a large part of that is climate change, but also land management. How are we handling all the combustibles in the landscape around them? In a sense, we've allowed our belief that our firefighting agencies and machines are strong enough to suppress anything that comes at us. And we're saying repeatedly, year after year, fire after fire, that that's not true. We can't stop these anymore. So there's a large component of land management, including the history of fire use or misuse. And of course, part of the tragedy here is that these are threatening communities. So that's another kind of land use question, is why are there communities here in this case. But not all of the story is bad. This year we had a success story in South Lake Tahoe. South Lake Tahoe had a bad fire in 2007. It frightened the community with great difficulty. I mean, it's very difficult to operate in that basin. They were able to do a lot of mitigation measures to provide protection to the communities following basic fire-wise principles. And when the Caldor fire burned into South Lake Tahoe in the valley, it simply leaped across. The fires then burned down towards the community on both sides. And they were able to be extinguished. In other words, the structures survived. They were defensible. So we certainly can do it if we wish. So the problem with climate change versus land use is that one is used to deny the other. One has to be, well, they're both involved. And from my perspective, they're both manifestations of a fossil fuel society. I mean, we couldn't pretend to fight fires the way we do if we didn't have all those petrol powered machines. How do we organize our landscapes? How do we build our communities? How do we get our electricity? This all goes back to various manifestations for fossil fuels. So climate is not all of it, but this conversion from fire in living landscapes to fire, as I think about it, in lithic landscapes is the deep story.
Certainly,
if I'm not being too abstract.
Lots of finger pointing back and forth, and you talked about managing fuels. You know that the state forestry department wasn't managing fuels like they should, and then you get the federal weren't managing. But in reality, I think you're right. It's probably a mix of land use, power lines where they probably shouldn't be, and then the fuels there to provide the situation. Is probably all of those things are coming together to create a perfect storm, much like they did at Peshtigo. Someone is just commenting that the forest at Peshtigo was a bit of a mesic landscape, included some, I think, hemlock and cedar, tamarack, some other things. So I think it's someone that it was a little bit more mixed forest, but certainly was not completely pine, but pine was a big part of it. In our previous presentations, which I'd encourage people to go back and watch, one of the questions I always asked, I mean, I don't know if you have an opinion about this, I always think of the forest fire season in Wisconsin as being a spring thing. Maybe that's because I fought fires in the spring in Wisconsin, but this was a fall event, which seemed kind of odd to me that you would have a forest fire in the fall when we normally have those, prior to green up spring fires. Yeah. So, and what other speakers have said is that, it was so dry, and then you had all the fall, leaf fall, and trees were shedding needles, and then, you had that tremendous wind, and you showed the front coming through. That all came together to provide this huge, the fuel was there and the wind was there, and it just took off.
I would say about 90% of the historic large fires occurred in the fall.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It just, I always think of it as the spring event in Wisconsin, but yeah, it makes sense, particularly the western states, because it would be really dry.
But I'm thinking of all the, almost all the ones I showed. One of the Adirondacks fires, the 1908 fire, I think was in, the 1903 fire was in the spring, but the rest were all fall fall fires, including even the 1825 Miramichi Fire Complex.
Oh, that's interesting. So Peshtigo wasn't that odd in that respect.
No,
Did the indigenous people have a more effective design to live in California 500 years ago? In the what do we know about we know a lot about the indigenous people in Wisconsin. They set fires to improve habitat and manage the landscape. But what about California?
yeah, no, it's very widespread burning in California. It's very fire prone, so it's easy to burn, and you can burn in many times of the year. A lot of the grasslands and savanna areas were burned as part of harvesting acorns, a lot of for hunting, gathering some of the grain. There are all kinds of stuff into the lower elevation, sort of montane forests and so forth, were very frequently burned for hunting, also to protect ambush from enemies. They wanted it open. They would leave some covert for habitat, but there was a very wide burning, and but it was all a very low intensity stuff because it was burned almost annually, and so there was very little to really take off and run. So we think now of a prescribed fire in this thing, it may be like a herd of bison charging across, but it's more like a swarm of mice. They were just chewing what was left, thinning it out. But it's also the case that this was a fire appropriate to the economy and lives of those people. And I'm not sure we're going to run San Francisco on acorns and rabbits. I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here.
No.
It's just that we have a different economy. We can learn from that history and that success and find equivalents that make sense today. But the belief that we can simply muscle our way to a success in combating fires, or even treating it as a war zone, is so misguided that I think even CAL FIRE and some of the really hardcore suppression people have recognized that we're beyond the limits of what we can do. We can't control these fires under extreme conditions, which are becoming more common. And it doesn't matter if you stop all the small stuff, because the big ones burn everything anyway when they occur. And that's when we need it.
It, maybe it's just my perception, but the situation in California, it seems like we just flipped a switch. That it was, we went, from relatively safe and manageable fire situations, and all of a sudden now we have people dying and homes burning. It just was like it was an on and off switch, and I think it's just a matter of all of the pieces of the puzzle coming together at the same time.
They're all coming together, and they're exaggerated.
Yeah.
I mean, California, we have a record of large fires in California, sort of official reviews, post-fire reviews dating back to 1919. So it's not new. What's new is that there had always been a break, 3 or 5 or 10 years between these really big outbreaks, which killed lots of people, burned lots of houses. But now it's coming every year.
Yeah. And
it's coming north and south. So there's no relief. So again, it's just everything's being intensified, compressed.
Question from our president of the Forest History Association, Ed Forrester. Have you reviewed the firefighting costs for the Caldor and Dixie fires?
I have not. They're still going. So we're still amassing. But we're talking about, multi-billion-dollar fire years now. The U.S. Forest Service, over half of its budget is now going to simply to firefighting, not mitigation, not pre-suppression, just firefighting. I mean, it's unable to do all the other tasks. Even agencies like CAL FIRE. I mean, you've got in California, you put the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, CAL FIRE, you have got a concentration of fire suppression power unrivaled in the world. And they can't hold the line anymore. So, and the cost is becoming huge. It's becoming so big now that there are serious bills to start. Let's start paying for this up front with prevention. And I mean, one of the two major power companies for the state, PG&E, had to declare bankruptcy because of what, $30 billion in lawsuits, plus criminal charges for the managers. So it's starting to look serious.
So Ed answered his own question here, typical Ed. He said the two fires are approaching $1 trillion, which that you just brought that up, that it's just astronomical, the costs that we're talking about.
Well, it must be $1 billion. I can't imagine $1 trillion, even in our economy.
Yeah.
But this is real money. This is how we spend our money. And this is like having a public healthcare system that builds emergency rooms and medical helicopter evacuation, but doesn't provide vaccinations, doesn't, just take care of basic broken bones and everything else. This is not how to, we can't do this.
Ed admitted he missed a digit, so it's more like $1 billion. Another question here, will Dr. Pyne be at the Peshtigo conference?
Nope, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. But and John will talk about this a little later. The registration for the conference has closed, but they are going to open up some ability to watch some of the presentations. So John will be talking about that at the end of the program here. So just making sure I didn't miss any questions. I think I have them all covered. I got to check the Q&A. Sometimes people put them in there. Nope, we are all well behaved. Nobody put questions in the Q&A.
Well, I would have one thought to remember. We need a little more hopeful ending than I provided. That we've gone through this before. We went through an era of mega fires, in some ways an order of magnitude larger and more lethal than what we've seen recently. We were able to muster a response, and that didn't happen until we decided they were gone away and we didn't need to keep doing the good sort of Pyrrhic hygiene stuff anymore. And similarly with cities, there's no reason to have these towns burned. We know how to fix that if we just choose to.
Gotcha. All right, so I'm going to turn it back to John Grossman.
Once again, I enjoyed this immensely, and thank you truly for taking the time to join us in this. We hope all of you enjoyed this evening's presentation. Please be aware that tomorrow you will receive an email inviting you to complete a survey on your webinar experience. Please take time to complete and return. Your advice is critically important to us in our efforts to serve you. We do believe that all of life really is connected over the miles and years, and your advice establishes that connection between us, and your feedback is the basis for our growth and development over time. Finally, make note that this series of webinars has been prelude and preparation for a conference in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, set for October 7th through 9th, 2021. Detailed information on that program can be found at www.foresthistoryassociationwi.com, which you see on the screen. While registration for on-site participation closed last week, we're planning to offer live feed of the Friday program, that's the 8th, to Forest History Association membership. In that setting, those accessing live feed of the program will be able to pose questions to the speakers for immediate response during the conference. If in your visit to our website you consider becoming a member, you'll be able to join the discussion again in a couple of weeks. Members receive an electronic and paper copy of each year's conference proceedings, a quarterly and monthly newsletter, and a warm feeling from knowledge that they're supporting K-12 education in Wisconsin on quite how we got here and what we've learned along the way. Again, thank you and good night.
Well, thanks for the invitation, guys. I hope your conference goes well for the rest of it.
Thank you for the
Thanks
presentation.
again. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.